Thanks for the invitation. I really appreciate it. And it actually means a lot to me. If I get invited to do something in Sweden, I'm very excited. And when I get invited to do something in Estonia, especially with Riga Kogu, it means a lot to me. And thank you for your kind words of introduction. What I'll try to do today is sketch a little bit the sort of global geopolitical landscape after or during the war in Ukraine and what it means for all of us. And I'll do it by giving you an introduction, then 3 points, and then a conclusion. And I'll do that in about 20 minutes from Florence over here. Actually, on Monday, as a good Finn, we're building a new sauna in Porkkala. So I was still carrying all the wood and got here back late last night. So let me kick off, and I know this is a little bit uncomfortable for an Estonian and a Finn, but I want to begin by quoting Lenin. Lenin once said that there are decades when nothing or little happens, and then there are weeks when decades happen. And I think that in the past few weeks or months, this is exactly what has taken place through Russian and Putin's aggression in Ukraine. For me, and I'm sure that all of you Estonians know exactly where I'm coming from, this is very much a 1917 or 1944, 1945 or 1989, 1991 moment, especially in Western history. It's one of those moments when we've seen the end of history emerge after the Cold War. In the words of Fukuyama, everyone moving towards liberal democracy, social market economy, and globalization. And we're supposed to live happily ever after. We did that pretty much for the better part of, say, roughly 30 years. I'm not saying that there were not glitches with the war in Georgia in 2008 or the annexation of Crimea, but when we see full-scale conventional warfare, senseless, mindless aggression and destruction, and the loss of human life right on our borders, it does have a tendency to change things. So let me try to explain how I see the global geopolitical landscape emerging. My first point is about modern geopolitics. My second point is about Russia and the West. And my third point, which is less discussed, I think, in public discourse, is about the West and the rest, before I then conclude. So let me kick off with modern geopolitics. Now, I fully understand that we have conventional warfare taking place in Ukraine at the moment. But the interesting thing is that if you look at geopolitics, traditionally it used to mean only tanks, armies, weapons, ammunition, and military capacity in general. But I actually think that modern geopolitics is much more than that. Because the argument here is that everything in today's world can be weaponized. So you can use energy as a weapon, as we've seen Russia do. You can use sanctions as a weapon, as we've seen the West do towards Russia. We can use information as a weapon, mainly in form of disinformation. We can use technology as a weapon. We can use currency as a weapon. And the main point here is just to say that nowadays warfare, or the line between war and peace, is quite blurred. And that we can see in the instruments of power and modern geopolitics that can be used. And funnily enough, the European Union actually has a lot of those weapons at its disposal, whether it's exclusive competence in competition policy, or exclusive competence in trade policy, or exclusive competence in customs. So in many ways, the European Union has gone from what I would call a regulatory superpower more towards an acting player, and actually quite impressively so. I remember there used to be such long-winded conversations in the early 2000s, not only about the important enlargement in 2004, but about making the European Union the most competitive area in the world, and too much regulation, and etc., etc. And now suddenly, with the financial crisis, with the asylum crisis, with COVID, and with the war in Ukraine, the European Union has actually become an acting player. So there are new instruments of power, and everything can be weaponized. Mark Leonard, I think, in an excellent book, has called this the Age of Unpeace. I haven't found a better name for it yet, but I do think that we live in this sort of new world of disorder, where there is no specific nexus of power, but a lot of weapons that can be used, and a lot of weapons that are at our disposal. Now, my second point today is about Russia and the West. And of course, for us, in Finland and in Estonia, we understand what's going on. We have different ways sometimes of expressing it, but we, with a border with Russia, know what it means. Now, in my mind, what we will see, and this is the question that you might want to deal with today, is a fully divided Europe. I don't call it the new Cold War, but we can say that there will be a new Iron Curtain between the European Union, or Europe, and Russia. And the split in two is total. You see, Russia, in my mind, will be fully isolated, which basically means isolated politically, economically, financially, sports, culture, transport, energy, you name it. What we'll be looking at in the near future is the biggest North Korea in the world right at our borders. Do we like that? No. We'd much rather have, me as a Finn, I'd love to have an Estonian Russia or a Swedish Russia as our neighbor. But that's not going to be the reality. We are going to have an aggressive, revisionist, imperialist, authoritarian, wounded and dangerous neighbor that we're going to have to live with. That's on one side of the fence. On the other side of the fence, we have more or less 40 European states, ranging from Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, all the way through Eastern and Central Europe, the Western Balkans, Western Europe, and the British Isles. These 40 countries are democracies. They believe in the rule of law. They believe in international cooperation, social market economy, and freedom. So it's very distinct from what we see on the other side of the new Iron Curtain, or the other side of the fence. And the big question for us is, how do we cope with this? Because we're looking at a time period which is not 1 year, 2 years, but more likely 5 years, a decade, even 2 decades, with total isolation of Russia. I mean, Putin is driven by 3 things: Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, and Catherine the Great. And if the mindset is that, we're not going to see Russia come back to the negotiating table. And we have all seen what Russian transitions mean. Quite often they mean actually a move towards what I call harder, more fundamentalist and aggressive power, as we actually saw in 1991 with the Yanayev junta coming in before Yeltsin, and then, of course, Putin. You all understand, we all know, Russians don't like unrest. Russians want stability, centralized power. So we're looking at this scenario for the foreseeable future. And the interesting thing is, in the 40 states that we have in Europe, some are in NATO, some are not. Some are in the European Union, some are not. Some are in both, some are in neither. And the same goes for some wanting to join, some not wanting to join. So what I think we need to do now is not only reconstruct Ukraine when the war is over. I have no idea when that's going to take place. But we need to reconstruct Europe on what I call 3 levels, or confederal Europe, which means the European Union, the 27, then what I call the European Community, which is countries that want to join the European Union but are not there yet. They need to have a clear path towards membership. And that is what I call the 5+3. In other words, the Western Balkans plus Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova. And then the third tier is the European area, which are countries that don't want to join but should be close to us, by which I mean the United Kingdom, Iceland, Norway, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland. And I think this confederal Europe, of course, needs backing up from NATO. There's no question of that. But this confederal Europe needs to have joint summit meetings at least twice a year. It needs to have joint ministerial meetings. It can even have civil servant meetings together. But there needs to be this we feeling in this group where we share information, cooperation, etc., etc. So Russia and the West is going to be a clear scenario. Of course, I won't talk about it today, but the added bonus with Putin's attack, if there's such a thing, is that the transatlantic partnership is back with a vengeance. My third and final point is to say that this is not only about modern geopolitics, it's not only about Russia and the West, but it is also about the West and the rest. And what do I mean by this? Now, a lot of us seem to think that the rest of the world is with us here, defending Ukraine, condemning Russian aggression. But the world is not that simple. The vote that we saw early on in the UN, 141 votes condemning, or countries condemning Russia, 35 abstaining, and 4 rogue states in favor, Eritrea, Syria, North Korea, and Belarus. We said, wow, this is great. Look, everyone is condemning Russia. It's not that easy. The 141 votes were soft, and they were scrambled together last moment, almost in an emotional state. The 35 votes that abstain, they represent over the half of the world's population. So when you start scraping the surface and you start reading and looking what is done and what has been said in this situation, it's much less hazy than we thought. A lot of African countries are non-aligned. They have not necessarily sympathies with Russia, but ties with Russia. But they certainly don't have sympathies with ex-colonial powers. So they will look at the West and say, listen, you guys, don't come and lecture us about territorial integrity and independence with your colonial past. This is your war. Sort out your mess, because it has ramifications on our energy prices, on our prices for fertilizers, and on our food prices. You are causing this, not us. Similar type of patterns, perhaps less so, but nevertheless, we can see in Latin America. Interesting enough, by the way, Bolsonaro in Brazil on the right and Lula in Brazil on the left saying that, well, this could have been prevented by Ukraine and so on and so forth. Then there are countries like India who are very much sitting on the fence. Practical reasons, they are the biggest arms importers from Russia. They have close ties there. Then there's China as an interesting case. A lot of people thought that they would pivot towards Russia. Oh, no, they're not. It's not only about reputational risk, which actually Chinese think about, but it's about pure business. Business with Russia is less than 80 billion a year. Business just with Europe is 800 billion a year. The Chinese are really scared about secondary sanctions. That's why sometimes they might be in rhetoric a little bit pro-Russian, but actually in reality, they're very pro-Western and are not going to put themselves in a situation that they will risk. Now, do they want Putin to win? Yes, they do, or at least Xi Jinping does. But the bottom line is that they're not going to pivot towards Russia. They're going to do what the Chinese do best. In other words, when power vacuums emerge where European and American sanctions exist, the Chinese are going to go in and create path dependencies into the system. Now, what I'm trying to say here is that there are short-term ramifications, which are about inflation, energy prices, fertilizers, and food. but there are long-term implications about some kind of a reordering of world politics and geopolitics and global politics. In my mind, we're not going to go into an era of deglobalization, but what we will probably see is the regionalization of globalization. So yes, global trade will continue, value chains as well, but there's some products, goods, services, and finance and production which is going to come closer to home. We saw that already with actually Donald Trump, but more specifically with COVID, when we realized that some products are better produced at home than elsewhere. And we're certainly seeing that now with the war in Ukraine. So please understand that this is about, number one, modern geopolitics, number two, Russia and the West, but also number three, the West and the rest. And you also have to understand that the world after World War II was created into the image of the winners of World War II and the image of the West, with Bretton Woods, with the World Bank, with the IMF, later on with GATT, the WTO, NATO, the European Union. So everything is skewed to a world order that is in our image rather than someone else's. I think actually, and here's where I start moving towards my conclusion. The Cold War was bipolar. The post-Cold War was unipolar, led by the United States. The world that we live in now is multipolar. It's actually quite messy. It almost feels as if we have some kind of disorder. So we have this sort of new geopolitical landscape that we're trying to come to terms with. I personally don't think that there's going to be any single power that is going to dominate this decade, the next decade, or this century, like the United States and the Soviet Union did in the last century. Yes, there will be big power competition, but it will be much more, how would I say, tactful, complicated, network-oriented. So it's very much about power having to be shared rather than held. I do think that the era of Eurocentrism or US-centricism is over. Now, does this mean that we should throw the baby out with the bathwater and say that all European or Western values are dead and we should not have a rules-based world order? No, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that we need to share power, we need to share order in a different kind of a way. That means that the world is not necessarily going to become more transactionalist, but it's not going to be driven by values. So we in the future cannot say that we will not trade with you if you don't stick to human rights, fundamental rights, and democracy, because we are not the ones who can make that judgment. This is what I wanted to say by way of introduction, and as a good Finn, 2 minutes ahead of time. Aite.
Well, thank you so much for this extremely insightful and also grasping speech that you held. Well, it reminds me an old Chinese saying that may you live in interesting times. Seems that these interesting times have gone by now, and I mean they are here to stay for a while by now, and let's just hope we can cope with these. There is a vivid interest from the audience to these issues, and yeah, let's dig into the questions, and luckily we've got some time for the discussion as well. So, as it is increasingly clear that Russia has clear imperial tendencies, is there truly any solution from the point of independent countries bordering Russia other than regime change in Russia? Do we have to wait for the regime change, and yeah, is it likely to happen?
Okay. Very good question. I don't think anyone has a crystal ball. If history is anything to go by, usually actually the difference between a dictatorship and a democracy is that in a dictatorship, the leader lives in a coffin in asylum or goes to jail. But in Russia, that's not very common. Actually, many Russian leaders have died of natural causes. There are only a few exceptions, throughout the Romanovs and the 1600s. So I would probably expect there to be some kind of a regime change. Speculation is ample about Putin's health and who would follow and so on and so forth. I don't have much time for that speculation. I think it takes away from reality. But quite often what happens in Russia is that you don't necessarily get a softliner following a hardliner. You get a similar hardliner of a top person. And the reason is very simple. The Russian leadership structure historically has been so centralized and hierarchical. So Russian czars, their sort of prerogative and power was never questioned because it was given by God and they never made mistakes. During the communist era, the leaders got it from the class struggle and never made mistakes. And now, of course, Putin is impeccable as well. Will there be a regime change at some stage? Yeah, I'm sure there will. But are we going to see some kind of modern Russian democratic revolution from below, changing the system of hierarchy, vassals, princes, oligarchs? I just don't see that. So start from the base case that we have to live to a similar Russia, regardless of who is in the lead, at least for the foreseeable future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I mean, we have to keep in mind that Russia has practically no democratic traditions, perhaps only some 10 to 20 years after the Cold War ended. Well, it brings us to the next question, that if the West needs to isolate Russia for a very long time, it is very costly for the West. Do you think the Western leaders are ready to pay that price?
The short answer is yes, they have to. But it's obviously the long answer is a little bit more complicated than that. Now, I've been warning already for a couple of months about something that I call war fatigue. And we sort of need strategic resilience to weather this out. So in the beginning, there's a very emotional, strong reaction of solidarity, which stems mostly actually from the European public. I mean, I'm here in Florence. I've been to my first sort of demonstrations and marches and given speeches in front of Santa Croce defending Ukraine and territorial integrity and independence and speaking against Russian aggression. And this was very much the sentiment here. It certainly was in Finland and Sweden. I mean, for goodness sakes, over 80% of the Finnish population is now in favor of NATO membership, and 188 MPs vote in favor of NATO membership. I mean, this would not have happened was there not this sort of strong sentiment of this can actually happen to us as well. But I've been saying that European leaders need to communicate the cost of war or the price of peace, whichever way you want to say that. And I'm afraid that now we're moving to the stage when people are starting to look more at inflation, at energy prices, at food prices, at the refugee situation, and starting to have a conversation already is how much are we paying for this war? If it is true that Ukraine needs somewhere between 3 to 5 billion euros a month, and I don't need to explain to an Estonian what 3 to 5 billion is. It's a hell of a lot of money. The Finnish annual budget is between state budget 50 and 55 billion. Our GDP is about 200 billion. So, we're talking huge amounts of money. And the question is, for how long can this war chest be sort of fed? And I really don't know. But fortunately, we have been able to already now push through one of the biggest sanction rounds the biggest sanction rounds we've seen in the history of European integration. And I think that this will continue. Public pressure will continue on that. So in that sense, I think that we'll keep on moving, and they will have to afford to continue the sanctions.
There is a question about the US. You talked about the Europe with some optimism that the strong attitudes towards Russia will be held. But what about US and the strong transatlantic partnership depends on the political stability in the US. Yeah, is it strong enough to survive midterm elections and the next presidential elections?
Yeah, really tough question there. You might know that I did my undergraduate work in the US and I'm an avid transatlanticist, and I follow American politics very closely. The problem that we have in the US is that the country is completely divided into two. It is as bipolar as it possibly can get in a bipartisan system. There is only black and white. There is only Democrat and Republican. And obviously, in democracy, a lot of times it's about timing. So we don't know whether Donald Trump or Joe Biden is a footnote of history at this stage, or someone like Donald Trump or someone like Joe Biden. There seems to be very little sort of, how do I say, gravity for a center type of a leader. Now, midterm elections, your guess is as good as mine, but American political pundits say that it will tilt towards the Republicans. But what form of republicanism is the question. Right now, there seems to be fairly strong support for funding the war in Ukraine. But there will be a time when we're going to have to start doing reconstruction in Ukraine. So it's very difficult to see where this leads. Having said that, I think it's very important to see that the Americans are committed to the transatlantic partnership anew. This is good news for us in Finland, for you in Estonia, but we should also be aware of a Trump-like of a candidate who is not necessarily going to be committed in a similar type of a way. So it's a very careful balancing act that we have to live with here. Okay.
Thank you for that. Let's get back to Russia once again, as audience is posting quite many questions in that regard. As we already talked about the potential regime change in Russia, and the comment here goes that is it really wise to isolate Russia fully, or perhaps we should retain some economic integration and access to Western information, for instance, through Russian students studying in Europe? North Korea is quite isolated for a long time, but no regime change.
Yeah, there's this wonderful Netflix series on how to become a tyrant. And it has 6 episodes. And with a focus on a different tyrant each time. So, Hitler, how to seize power, then Gaddafi, how to, kill your opposition, then Idi Amin, how to spread fear, Gaddafi on how to, create society, and actually Stalin, how to lie to the public. But the key one is North Korea, how to stay in power forever, right? And I mean, you're right. I mean, we should not make perhaps the same mistakes that we made in the 1990s, but with Russia. But there's a careful balancing act here. So focus on the youth, focus on the students, focus on the liberal internationals, etc., etc. And be prepared, if there is a serious regime change, to do that switch very quickly, to get Russia, involved in the West again. But, in Finland, we've sort of relied on both idealism and realism. Idealism is that in bona fide, we wanted to cooperate with Russia and bring them closer to the West and, increase trade and integrate them into the West in that way. But then realism in having one of the largest standing armies in Europe, including 62 F-18s and now 64 F-35s. And it's not exactly like we bought those to defend ourselves from Estonia and Sweden, So, the bottom line here is just to say that, yes, be prepared to open up. But in this particular moment, we have no other solution than to isolate Russia. My big fear here is that, this is going to end in territorial loss for Ukraine. And that, in my mind, makes things extremely complicated. But I just don't know where this is going to end. But I know that our session is ending. And before we end, and before you shut me off, I just want to tell one thing to all of you and all of my Estonian friends. If you had not joined the European Union and especially NATO when you did, Finland would not have been as safe as it has been in the past decade. So I would just like to personally thank you for taking that decision in early 2000, because your NATO membership increased security in the Baltic Sea region, in the Baltics, and in the Nordics. And I hope now that we are joining NATO as well, finally, that we can do the same for you.
Thank you so much. I also think that your decision, the Finnish decision to join NATO, is mutually beneficial to Estonia, similarly to how you mentioned that joining EU by Estonia was useful, beneficial for Finland. So great to see that we are thinking alike. In Estonia, the attitudes that you just expressed are very strong. Let's have this decisiveness to do what it takes to win the war and to have the reasonable outcome. I mean, the outcome that suits Ukraine and that would not provoke further attacks by Russia. Thank you so much for your time. This was both thought-provoking and eye-opening. And good luck with the lecture series on YouTube. I'll stay waiting for the next episodes. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Right. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.